In your reading for this quest, you read quite a bit about Darwin, Wallace, and their ideas on evolution by natural selection, but there wasn't a whole lot about this interaction between Darwin and Wallace around, 1858, 1859, when Darwin was thinking about publishing his ideas, and how Wallace sort of, without knowing it, pushed him to publish. So this short video is just a little bit about that, so you have a better idea of some of the really interesting story that is, the Darwin and Wallace connection. We know quite a bit about Darwin. You read quite a bit of his basic biographical details in the McClellan and Dorn reading. With Wallace, his story is a bit different. Where Darwin was born into a wealthy family, Wallace was not. Wallace had to work with his brother to work his way through school. He had to save up his money to go on his journeys into South America and into the Malay Archipelago. So Darwin's father paid for his 5-year journey, and Darwin didn't really have to worry about a whole lot. Wallace, on the other hand, was always working, always trying to figure out a way to make money so that he could go on these scientific expeditions. Wallace was much younger than Darwin, and he didn't have the same kind of social or scientific connections in the London scientific scene that Darwin had. So he was kind of starting off, he was sort of, to Darwin, a young whippersnapper. He didn't really have all of this experience. And Wallace really looked up to Darwin as sort of a mentor. So that's the kind of relationship that they started out having. We know that Darwin went on his voyage of the Beagle from 1831 to 1836. There's a map of it in your reading, and here's another map. We know that the particular voyage itself, the main goal was to sort of get some of the latitude and longitude readings of many of the places that they stopped, make contact, collect items. Darwin went along as the naturalist, as well as a friend to Fitzroy, and in general, they had a pretty good time for about 5 years, and Darwin brought tons of specimens, so he was working the whole time. After 5 years away, Darwin brought back 1,700 pages of notes, 800 pages of journals, 4,000 labeled skins, bones, and other specimens, 1,500 preserved specimens. Darwin's training as a gentleman, riding horses and being able to shoot birds and animals from horseback. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that, but it's not easy from what I understand. And that type of training, that type of preparation really inadvertently prepared him for this type of trip. These images here are of some of Darwin's specimens that remain in the Cambridge collections that, you could go see if you have any inclination to do something like that. And from his work over the course of 5 years, he began to think about how organisms change. And you read a lot about some of his influences, Lyell, Paley, Malthus, and during his trip, he wrote out this tree of life up here. He says, I think, and as you can see this number 1 down at the bottom of the tree, and he thinks that organisms basically branched off of one organism, and that's how things sort of developed. He doesn't know where that first organism came from. He does not speculate on that, but he believes that there was an original organism at some point, and then you get a bunch coming off of that. And this is based on just 5 years of research. He continued to research throughout his life. Once he returned to England, he got married, he settled down, and he started to write up his specimens. He started to write up his notes. He had a lot of works that came out before The Origin of Species. So from 1836 to 1859, he was working, doing experiments. He was looking at worms and flowers and basically anything he could get his hands on. One of the famous things was his barnacles. He wrote a book. Here you can see a monograph on the subclass Cirripedia, and he had all of these beautiful drawings in them. But he was doing research on how do these types of organisms change and develop. He also wrote up the zoology of the beagle, because he had brought back a number of specimens that hadn't been seen before in Europe, and especially in Britain. And it's a beautiful piece of work where you have these really intricately illustrated animals and plants. and bugs and things like that. So he wrote up the zoology of the beagle. So he was fairly famous in the scientific community in London before Origin even came out. He was very, very well known. Because of all of his specimens, he had a number of people in the scientific world, all over the world, who were writing to him for help and say, hey, could you send me this specimen? I know you have about 25 of these things. Can you spare one so I can study it? Or can you answer this question for me? And a lot of times Darwin would say, sure, but then you have to answer this question for me. So he built up this field of correspondence, essentially. So he had a lot of people that he knew and that he was friends with. This is a really important social setup. We know from 1854 to 1862, Wallace was journeying in the Malay Archipelago. He had quite an adventure there. Some of his boxes were lost in shipwreck, so he had to replace them, which he didn't have the money to do. These are boxes full of specimens that he was planning on selling when he got back to London. That didn't work out. He got malaria multiple times. Usually once you get it, you're sort of hounded by it for quite a while. So he was ill, fighting ill health much of the time, but he still developed a certain theory about biogeography, which is basically the development of life in different environments. This is a map of the Malay Archipelago, and this red line is known as the Wallace line, which actually separates two different environments. And basically, on the left side of that line, you get certain types of organisms, and then very abruptly on the right side of that line, you get completely different types of organisms based on what's known as their biogeography. In 1855, he actually published an article explaining what biogeography was and what's called the discontinuity of species, which basically means that you have, in different environments, different types of species are going to develop, even if they started out 100,000 years ago as the same species. According to the Sarawak law, which is what Wallace called it, they will develop very, very differently. And again, here you have the Wallace line and the Sarawak law based on it. In 1858, working from these ideas, Wallace sent an essay to Darwin. It was called On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. He sent this to Darwin, and this is the article that McClellan and Dorn talk about as being the one that really shocked Darwin into talking to Charles Lyell about, what do I do? So, what did this article say? Well, according to Darwin, he basically says that this article that Wallace sent to me, basically I have all of the same ideas. As you can see here, he says, he's writing to Charles Lyell in 1858. He says, some year or so ago, you recommended me to read a paper by Wallace in the Annals of Science, which had interested you, and as I was writing to him, I knew this would please him much, so I told him. And this is the 1855 article on the Sarawak law. Wallace has today sent me the enclosed and asked me to forward it to you. It seems to me well worth reading. Your words have come true with a vengeance that I should be forestalled. You said this when I explained to you here very briefly my views of natural selection, depending on the struggle for existence. I never saw a more striking coincidence, and this is the 1858 article that Darwin's talking about. He says to Lyell, if Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters. Please return me the manuscript, which he does not say he wishes me to publish, but I shall of course at once write and offer to send to any journal. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed, though my book, if it will ever have any value, will not be deteriorated, as all the labor consists in the application of the theory. I hope you will approve of Wallace's sketch, that I may tell him what you say. My dear Lyell, yours most truly, Charles Darwin. And this actually is a letter that you can see on the Darwin Correspondence Database at darwinproject.ac.uk. That's where I got it. What you have to understand here is that basically this is Darwin saying to Charles Lyell, holy cow, you told me that someone was going to scoop me, and this guy Wallace is about to do it. He basically, in 5 years of study in the Malay Archipelago, has come up with the same conclusion as I have in my 30 years of study, essentially. So he says, all my originality will be smashed, and what do I do, basically? Lyell wrote back to Darwin and said, well, what we should do is we should publish, you need to write up a short abstract, and we need to publish that quickly before Wallace realizes what's going on, because at this point, Wallace is still out in the field. He's in the Malay Archipelago. You're not getting emails. You're not getting phone calls, right? This is snail mail. Literally, it's, it takes 6 weeks, 8 weeks if you're lucky to get a letter back and forth. So, what does Darwin respond to Lyell? He says, the advantage which I should take, being that I am induced to publish from privately knowing that Wallace is in the field. It seems hard on me that I should be thus compelled to lose my priority of many years' standing, but I cannot feel at all sure that this alters the justice of the case. First impressions are generally right, and I at first thought would be dishonorable in me now to publish. So basically Darwin is saying to Lyell, look, you think I should publish, but Wallace is in the field, and I can't honorably do that. But at the same time, I've been working on this for like 25 years, so what the heck should I do? What seems honorable? What is an honorable solution so that I'm fair to this guy who really trusts me with his ideas? Well, here's what ends up happening. Lyell convinces Darwin to allow his paper to be read out loud in front of a meeting of scientific minds, and to include Wallace's paper as well. Darwin very quickly writes up an abstract, and Wallace's essay that he had sent to Darwin is read to the Linnaean Society. And the Linnaean Society, these are the main scientific guys in London. Like, these are the ones that you want to be hearing your paper. They include Charles Lyell and a number of other guys who are going to see the importance of this scientific idea. This meeting is held July 1st, 1858, without Wallace's knowing that this is going on. Because remember, he's still in the field. Even if Darwin had written a letter right away when they had decided to do this, Wallace still wouldn't get news of it for weeks and weeks and weeks. So in order to seem honorable, they include Wallace's paper in the reading. Darwin's paper is read first, Wallace's is read second, so it establishes Darwin's priority. There's also a joint publication of their essays in the Transactions of the Linnaean Society, which is their journal. This, of course, goes out to members of the Linnaean Society all over Europe and the rest of the world. So, again, Darwin's paper is published first, and then Wallace's paper, which again establishes Darwin's priority. And Wallace is included, which is great, because he should be, but at the same time, Darwin is saying, hey, I was thinking about this first, even though Wallace was a little bit more brave with his ideas and letting people know. Both Darwin and Wallace, their ideas about evolution by natural selection were influenced by Lyell's uniformitarianism and Thomas Malthus's fight for survival, and you read about that already in the McClellan and Dorn reading. Wallace, on the one hand, focused on changes through major, big populations of organisms, and Darwin tended to focus on individuals. So, an individual finch and the changes through that particular individual from his ancestors. And then Wallace tended to focus on the large population of, say, finches or giraffes or what have you. And again, another difference is that Darwin tended to focus on traits that influenced sexual selection in animals, and Wallace focused on the geographical and the environmental selection of traits, so the natural selection. These are two of the major differences between Darwinism and Wallace's ideas of evolution. Another outcome of Wallace writing to Darwin was the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. He published it in 1859, and even though it is full of chapters upon chapters upon chapters, it's like 450 pages long. If you'd like to read it, it's not very exciting, but it is full of evidence. I mean, that's what Darwin had spent the last 25 years doing, was putting together all of this evidence to support his idea. And it mainly focused on this, the divergence of characteristics. So he starts off with 10 or 12 original organisms down at the bottom, and you can see how through successive generations he believes that traits diverge, characteristics diverge. We have to understand that Darwin knew that his ideas on the evolution of organisms would cause a stir. He, in fact, said in his book that he knew this would cause a considerable revolution. It was not the fact that Darwin was saying that organisms changed over time. We had those ideas from Aristotle. The important part of Darwin's idea was the mechanism. So this mechanism of selection, this was the big deal. In fact, the very last part of Darwin's book, this is the very last sentence of On the Origin of Species, he says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." A couple things we need to notice about this final sentence. He is not trying to say that he doesn't talk about the origin of life. He talks about the origin of different species. So he doesn't know, right, if these few forms or one original being at the beginning. He's not saying anything about that. He also is making sure to talk about evolution, this idea of natural selection, that it is a law of nature, because he talks about the planet goes on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, and there are fixed natural laws as well, such as evolution. He did not consider that this would cause a big religious revolution. In fact, people wrote him letters from all over the world, and his response was, "I did not mean to write atheistically. I didn't mean to write as though there weren't a God. I am talking about scientific laws." That's what he's focusing on, which is why talking about this fixed law of gravity is so important, because people agree that gravity is a law of nature. Just like he's saying, we have to agree, based on all of this mountain of evidence that I have given you over the past 459 pages, we have to come to the conclusion that evolution is definitely a natural law.